On Saturday, August 2nd, 2014, I was in my hometown of Jackson, Michigan to document the Jackson and Lansing Railroad. The short line was established in October 2010, following Norfolk Southern's agreement to lease its Lansing secondary to the Adrian and Blissfield subsidiary for 20 years. The Jackson and Lansing Reporting Mark Jail once used classic EMD GP9s to pull trains between its namesake cities. This never-before-seen footage, recovered from a hard drive crash, shows GP9's 1758 and 1760 in charge of train JL1 on a rare daylight run from Jackson to Mason. I first set my eyes on the train at CP Jackson just after sunrise on the Amtrak Michigan line. The control point is right by Michigan Central Station, the oldest continuously operated passenger station in the United States, open every day since September 1st, 1873. Now on jail-operated trackage, heading northbound, we caught up with the train at West Parnall Road in Blackman Township. The Adrian and Blissfield Railroad Company was sold to Transportation Holdings in August 2021. Led by Chris Bagwell, formerly of the Great Lakes Central Railroad, he and the new owners plan to expand business on the jail and enhance customer service. Just over 10 miles north of Jackson is the community of Rives Junction, where Michigan Central's Jackson, Lansing, and Saginaw and Grand River Valley main lines split. It's also where Michigan Electric Railway, an interurban line, once crossed over the Grand River Valley main. It was abandoned in the late 1920s, but the interurban depot remains, now a local biker bar. South of Rives, the two Michigan Central lines were joined together as a double-track main, capable of 59-mile-per-hour passenger service and 39-mile-per-hour freight operations. Today, the Jackson to Grand Rapids and interurban right-of-ways are used as an access road by Consumers Energy. The thick morning fog made visibility a challenge for the train crew, who were already facing Long Hood forward. The previous owner of the Adrian and Blissfield preferred high hood locomotives because they forced both crew members to be alert, looking for obstructions that the other could not see from the opposite side of the cab. Essentially, he said that he wasn't going to pay one guy to sleep while the other ran the train. Leslie, Michigan is at the crest of a slight grade. With such a short train in tow, the GP9s weren't working all that hard. Leslie is home to a historic Michigan Central depot, constructed in approximately 1902. It replaced the original wooden depot, which opened in 1865. Passenger service ended in 1959, with the depot serving as a railroad storage building for a while before being sold several times and turned into a restaurant sometime in the early 1990s. The restaurant closed in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and in 2023, a pot dispensary set up shop within the historic building. North of town, the jail rolls through fertile Michigan farmland, with many rural grade crossings between Leslie and Mason. Near Eden, I decided to take some still photos and went to check on how close the train was to the grade crossing. Thankfully, I had time to relocate my video camera for a better angle. Most of these coil cars were for RSDC Manufacturing in Holt, the short line's largest customer. As of 2025, Train JL1 delivers cars to Norfolk Southern's Jackson Yard Monday through Thursday, averaging between 15 and 20 cars long. After interchanging with Norfolk Southern around 3 a.m., the train departs Jackson for Mason with inbound cars for its customers, including roughly a dozen coil cars for RSDC. South of Mason, the train serves Michigan packaging, and then crews swap out for the afternoon train to Lansing. The Mason to Lansing turn operates as symbol Z646. The train serves several customers around the Lansing belt and interchanges with CSX and Canadian National. As of late, CSX has been providing the short line with the majority of its traffic, whereas in the past it was Norfolk Southern. Just after 9 a.m., I recorded the train passing by the year-old Mason engine house, my last shot before grabbing breakfast at the Mason Depot Diner, thankfully still in business as of 2025. A fresh crew would drop off the coils for RSDC. With its facility far from public view, I caught up with the train that afternoon in Holt, en route to CSX at Ensel. Now running as Z646, the train traversed the Lansing Belt, where it dropped off a lone boxcar for CSX and left a gondola for Lewis Padno's scrap metal. At East Michigan Avenue in downtown Lansing, I recorded train Z646 with the historic state capitol building in the background. This section of track is owned by Norfolk Southern, but is leased to CSX. After dropping off its cars, I caught the classic EMDs one final time at North Grand River Avenue. Since they wouldn't be doing anything but running back light to Mason for the next day's trip to Jackson, I ended my chase here. A little more than 2 weeks later, on Monday, August 11th, I got a call from a railroader letting me know that the jail would be making another rare daylight run to Jackson. So at 1 a.m., I drove to Leslie, where I intercepted the train on its way south. The grade crossing at East Race Road was malfunctioning, so the crew had to stop and flag the crossing using flares. Leading the train south was GP9 number 1760, my personal favorite locomotive on the jail. It was built in October 1955 for the Pennsy, making the engine just shy of 60 years old at the time of this recording. 1758 was also built for the Pennsylvania Railroad in November 1956. The 1760 was equipped with an old cast Nathan P5 air horn, while the 1758 retained a Leslie RS3L with a dead 25 bell. I followed the train to Jackson, finding several rural grade crossings to record the southbound. Anticipating Jail's arrival, I returned to the historic Jackson station, where I saw this westbound Amtrak Wolverine, likely an extremely late 3:55, which normally arrived just after 8 p.m. Although my memory has faded, I believe this train suffered from a major mechanical issue, which delayed it until the wee hours of the morning. My good friend Danny Kay was the conductor that day. Seeing him was always a joy, and he made sure to say hi whenever I was trackside. With Amtrak now clear of CP Jackson, train JL1 was permitted to cross over the Amtrak Michigan line to enter yard limits. The yard lead begins right at the station, and you can see the track to the far left of the screen.
Train JL1 restricting protect yard out.
In Jackson Yard, I found the Jackson and Lansing running back down an empty track to tie on to its outbound cut of cars left by Norfolk Southern's night crew. Now coupled to the outbound cut of 41 cars, the crew of JL1 tied down the power for the morning relief crew to come on duty. They'd take the train back to Mason, so I waited patiently for them to show up. Not too long after sunrise, I noticed this doe feeding on grain spilled from a hopper. Deer are plentiful at Jackson Yard, and the crews enjoy seeing them. By this time, Jackson and Lansing's new crew had arrived and were prepping the train for departure. At 8:15 a.m., westbound Amtrak Wolverine 351 passed by the yard as it was slowing for a station stop at nearby Jackson. After Amtrak made its station stop, JL1 was given the green light to proceed out of Jackson Yard for its northbound trip back to Mason. Mechanic Street in downtown Jackson is an excellent crossing to record the jail and highlights the differences in gradients between the Amtrak Michigan line and the Lansing Secondary. This crossing was unique because it was one of only two in the entire state to have isolated traffic signals in the middle of the road, reinforced with concrete bases. The other set still stands in Blissfield, Michigan, along the old road. Just north of Rives Junction, I caught the slow-moving manifest train snaking its way through a scenic curve surrounded by marshes. Note the pole line to the right of the railroad. It follows the former interurban railway between Rives and Jackson, allowing maintenance crews easy access.
Go ahead.
In Leslie, the train slowed to a crawl as it passed by some Jackson and Lansing maintenance of way workers who were repairing the rails and the malfunctioning grade crossing just north of the depot. In 2022, the Jackson and Lansing Railroad began supplementing its fleet of aging GP9s with more powerful and fuel-efficient diesels. 1751 was essentially replaced by SD40-2 821, the first six-axle to operate on the line since the early 2000s. Soon after, several GP40s joined the roster, and 1751 was sold to a Mexican railway in 2024. The remaining two GP9s were sold in summer 2025 to other rail operators in the southeast. I sure do miss seeing the GP9s, and will always look back at this footage with fondness, as it also reminds me of my earliest days of rail fanning with a professional camera. With that said, thanks so much for tuning in for all these years, and I hope you enjoyed this look back at the Jackson and Lansing Railroad as much as I did. Until next time, happy railroading!